Welcome to the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Every week, you'll hear strategies for building your online service-based business your way. And now, here's your host, veteran freelancer, author, and TEDx speaker, Laura Briggs.
Hello, listeners. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Today, I have a guest with me to talk about this important subject of some of the financial issues and challenges and potential in the future with finances for freelancers. So welcome to the show. Why don't you go ahead and tell everyone a little bit about you and who you are?
Sure. So, Laura, thanks very much for having me. I know we've tried to schedule this before, but I'm glad that we finally had a chance to talk. My name is Andre Lee. I'm the founder of Numina, and Numina is a new type of company that is trying to redefine the way banking can be made a lot more useful for freelancers everywhere in the world.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show too. I think kind of all of this starts with the fact that there are certain things out there that are not necessarily as easy for freelancers. They're really sort of outdated or old school methods of doing business or handling your finances, or even things like insurance. They haven't really caught up to the fact that there's this whole new world. Like just going through the process of buying a house recently, like we had to get copies of all of my 1099s and our tax returns, whereas, my husband just needed to provide one W-2 for his one employer. And that was taken definitely much more seriously than all of my 1099s and years of returns. So let's start with talking about, what do you see as kind of wrong with banking right now that's inspired where you're headed with Numina?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So what's wrong is that modern banking today devised a business model to essentially service the industrial economy, which has pretty much been the defining way in which countries have been building their economies for the last 200 or 300 years. And a lot of it in the last 70 to 80 years have revolved around this notion of financing full-time workers who had a single job. They had an employer, and therefore they had a paycheck that was coming to them, twice a month or monthly, and it was predictable. And because you could kind of see what types of jobs they would hold given their education, banks built this business model that could kind of predict what this person's going to earn today and what this person's going to earn 10 years from now and what this person's going to be earning the day they retire. But, as you know, digital technologies disrupted all of that and disrupted most industries. And modern banks simply haven't adapted their business model to change to the new ways of working within the digital economy, the sort of sharing economy, the collaboration economy, if you like to call it. And one of the big things that happened in the last 30, 40 years with the digital revolution is it's created the ability for a lot of people to start becoming their own bosses and work remotely because they had access to the tools they needed to perform that work and deliver it. And they didn't have to be in an office, and they didn't have to have a single boss. And so they left their jobs and became freelancers. Back in 1974, if I recall the numbers correctly, and these could be wrong because it's always been very hard, I think, for government agencies to define what a freelancer really is. Around 7% of Americans were freelancing in 1974. Now today, supposedly, as many as 35 to 40% of Americans are freelancing. And if you believe the pundits, the forecast is that as many as 50% or more of the American workforce will be freelancing within the next 10 years. That's a massive sea change in how we work. And that requires banking, right, to start to think about how do you address the unique challenges and ways that these people work that your business model wasn't originally created for in the first place. So that's why so many people are falling between the gaps, or through no fault of their own, are finding themselves sitting outside of the modern banking system and unable to access credit like full-time workers can. So I think fundamentally, it's just a problem of banking developed itself to service an industrial economy, and the industrial economy is no longer and has been replaced by a new type of economy that is driven by different economic principles and is being serviced by a new class of workers that largely report to themselves, and they work differently and they have different challenges, and banks just aren't equipped or incentivized yet to switch their business models to address that.
Yeah, I think all of that makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of ways in which launching a freelance business is easier than launching a more traditional business because we often don't need, a massive loan to start our business. We don't need a brick and mortar store. We don't need product. We don't have to worry about hiring staff and all of those other things that come with a different type of business. But it does have some downsides in if you do need money, even if that's just in terms of like a working capital loan or cash flow, there are very few products out there on the market that provide that sort of stopgap support or even the support for someone to invest in some aspect of their business, like redoing their website or something like that. It just doesn't exist. Trying to get traditional business loans as a freelancer is pretty much impossible because, one of the first things they'll ask for is they'll want so many months of your bank statements. And depending on how long you've been freelancing, that may not tell the full picture of your business. I know for me, my entire business was pretty much run through PayPal the first 3 or 4 years. And so I didn't really have, that's where everything was coming into and out of. And so it was hard to just sort of align with what traditional banks were looking for. So you've obviously talked to a lot of freelancers in developing some of the tools that Numina is thinking about or is already in process of. How do these challenges show up in the day-to-day life for freelancers? What are they saying? What are their frustrations regarding financing, banking, kind of that whole realm?
So I think many of the things that you've said are spot on. I think the first thing we need to recognize, and this is where I think banks may be struggling today to adapt their business models to this new reality, is that freelancers are a business. And they also happen to be the product of their business, right?
Yeah.
And, businesses need access to financial capital to be able to grow. And the simple fact of life is you cannot generate wealth if you can't take risks. And you can't take risks if you can't get access to financial capital. It's a fairly straightforward formula. And so when you're a freelancer, if you can't get access to capital, the amount of risks that you'll be able to take advantage of new opportunities is going to be very limited. So consequently, you'll always be shooting for getting enough jobs to support a consistent cash flow so that you can, keep your life running at an even pace. But yet you're never going to have those opportunities to step off that hamster wheel and say, yeah, but I've learned a lot of things and I've created some great relationships with my clients and I see all these new opportunities. And if I do this or I do that, I could grow my business tenfold. Like you can't do it because you can't get access to the capital to take those risks. So basically the problem with the banking world today is that the choices you have, which as you described are few to none, basically means you can't take risk. And that basically means then you have to kind of run on this hamster wheel, running after project, and you can kind of only optimize at the periphery or the edges to make it better. But that's not going to make you rich, right?
Yeah.
Then, if you and I have the same IQ and grew up in the same town and everything else was the same between us, and you worked harder than me, you're going to make more money than me, but you're not going to make 50 times more money than me, right?
Yeah.
But by the same token, what really defines somebody that outperforms everyone else was their opportunity to take risk. And if you are able to take risk because you had some capital to do it and you make a lot of money, by virtue of the fact that you did that, you're now building new and improved and augmented identity and social capital, which enables you to get even more capital so you can take even more risk, right? And so that sort of pathway of growth is really unfortunately closed to most freelancers. And I think the other problem is that for a lot of freelancers, as you said, they are the business and they kind of have to do everything around that business, like, find clients and manage their brand and do the work and administrate their business. And that's terribly time consuming, right? But I think where we see lots of issues are people coming to us and saying, look, I need to figure out some way of scaling myself up so I can improve my profit margins, or I can go after better customers or bigger projects or things that are more challenging to me. I need to be able to take those risks. And I don't know how to do that because really the only tool that I have are my wits and my sweat. I don't have the capacity to invest in partnering with others or buying more equipment, or I don't have that capacity to do it, to take those risks. So I
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, I think this conversation around the idea of being able to take risks is so important because I haven't really thought about it from that perspective before, but it's true. We hear a lot of these stories about, many of these entrepreneurs who are not freelancers who had to work really hard and put in the sweat equity, but there was some point at which they took a risk or a gamble or made an investment or were able to secure something that they needed to go to the next level. And that was really sort of the hinge on which their whole business was able to turn and begin to grow. And it's very true that freelancers are a lot of times true solopreneurs, right? They are in charge of everything. They may partner with other freelancers as subcontractors. They may hire an accountant or, another financial professional, but they're really doing everything on their own. One of the things I've seen that's gotten a little better in the last 10 years since I got started, when I got started, it was very difficult to find a completely digital bank, right? So even just like a bank where I don't ever need to go into the local branch. And as a military spouse, I didn't want something local so that it could travel with me as I moved. And finally, now we're seeing a number of small business digital only banks pop up. I feel like that may be the first wave in some of these changes that are coming to make things more accessible for freelancers. What else do you see on the horizon of either things that have already happened or developments that you see are going to need to happen in the next couple of years just due to the number of freelancers that are out there in the market?
So I think a whole lot of things need to happen, but I think the most important thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a reliable mechanism where freelancers can tell their story in an organized way so they can surface all the signals about who they are and why they're creditworthy and why they have good prospects for the future in a way that's curated and easily accessible to capital providers like banks or other types of investors. That's the missing link,
Yeah.
because a lot of these freelancers have the story. In fact, freelancers by nature, I would argue, for the most part, are more resilient. They're kind of tougher people, if you would, right? They have to make sure they get the jobs to support themselves or they don't eat.
Yeah.
And that brings with it a sense of discipline, a sense of optimism, a sort of a way of thinking about risk and uncertainty that a lot of full-time workers don't have, and in my opinion are worse credit risks. But
Yeah.
when both of them go to the bank, the worst credit risk actually gets the money, and the one that's probably the better risk and has the better upside doesn't get the money, right? So it's a tragedy in terms of what the outcome is. And one of the reasons why is because banks are very used to creating models in which there's a set of data inputs or information inputs that they've come to rely on external providers like Experian and TransUnion and others provide to them.
Yeah.
And these third-party companies who are aggregating this data are looking at certain places to get it, and they're not looking at all the other places where the signals that signal someone's credit worthiness that might be a freelancer might have those signals housed. They're not looking there. And there's no incentive to look there because there's already millions of people that they're collecting data on. They're getting paid for that every day. So there's very little incentive for them to do that. So they're not looking for it. So consequently, my argument would be, it's not that banks don't want to underwrite and lend to freelancers. It's just that they don't know how to, and they don't understand how to think about the risk return for the loans or the investments that they make into these people, because they don't have access to their story, and they're not incentivized as an organization to figure out how to go out there and collect all that data and then build models to understand it. Like that's not what they do, right?
Yeah.
So the easiest answer is, I just won't do it.
It's so unfortunate because there's so much potential there. Like you said, I don't think it's that they're actively saying we don't want to create things that could solve these problems for freelancers, but not knowing how is completely leaving all of these people who are interested in finding solutions out of the picture. And then the banks are also missing out on all of that opportunity to do business with this massively growing section of the workforce, and a section where increasing numbers of them doing it full time are making a really good living doing it. So it's like, if they had access to some of this capital, if they had services and banking products that served them better, it would allow them to grow their business even faster. And then they have more money to spend. So it's this unfortunate disconnect, because it's like both parties are choosing to exist without each other right now because there is no other option, or it's too difficult to figure out the solution, but it's really doing a disservice to both.
Exactly. So what's really needed is a place where freelancers, in my opinion, freelancers can go and sort of safely tell their story, and then have someone who's just trying to think about, how do I package that story and turn it into a form that banks are willing to consume and are used to consuming, right? It's a translation issue.
Yeah.
It's not an intention issue.
Yeah, I think culturally, there's going to have to come a shift in perception, because I know definitely when I started freelancing, very few people understood it. It was very much treated as, oh, it's temporary. You've cobbled together a number of gigs because you don't want to work, or you can't get a job, or it's a bad economy, so you're doing this as a stopgap. And I agree with you a lot that a lot of times some of the people in more traditional employment situations, they could quit tomorrow. They could get laid off next week. But that sort of W-2 status and that history there is taken as so much more, I guess, valuable, because it fits nicely into the models that banks have. And then if you look at freelancers, some of my clients have had me on retainer for 5 years, 8 years, 9 years, way longer than I've ever held any job. And I think that's something for freelancers to think about too, is how resilient you are, how capable of pivoting you are. Because if you lose your job today, it would not be easy for someone with a traditional job to go find a new one tomorrow or next week. It could take them months to do that. Whereas freelancers, we think about that all the time. We are used to clients coming and going and contracts wrapping up, or even firing a client and needing to fill that spot for cash flow purposes. And so in a way, just like you said, freelancers are really well equipped to keep their business running continuously, even though it is not the exact same amount of money every month. They're much more in a position to figure out how to adapt in the moment and continue to have a business that is at least stable. And I think that's something that a lot of society still doesn't understand yet. There's still this perception that freelancing is like, you're doing it because you want freedom and flexibility, but it's not real. It's not a real career. It's just there's no way you could be making money doing that. And that's just not what I see anyways with a lot of the freelancers that I know and have worked with.
And you're very right about that. There's been this stigma attached to freelancing historically, as you said. Oh, you're freelancing because you can't get a real job, right?
Right.
And and the sad fact is that the United States is much more advanced in terms of thinking about freelancing and accepting it than, for example, Europe or Asia is. So if you think it's bad in the US, wow, you should see how bad it is in Asia. In Asia, as recently as 10, 20 years ago, if you want to do a startup, you were frowned upon, because it basically said, there are people basically looked at you, said, okay, so you really can't afford to get a job at some of the top companies here and provide a stable life for your family. You're taking this risk, and you're kind of cast as an outsider. So it may be, you may think it's bad in the U.S., but wow, it's much worse when you get outside the U.S. in terms of that stigma and what it means culturally. So that's very true. What we're seeing, we've been slowly growing a community of freelancers who are coming to us and telling us their stories, and we're beginning to learn how to gather and understand those stories and package them, and then create financial solutions for them that give them access to capital they need to grow their business. We've seen basically, I would say, two very clear areas where they're unable to get any capital. One is capital to grow their business, so growth capital. And growth capital is much more like equity, right? So they're sort of saying, look, I need to raise $50,000 and then I can build these pieces to my business, but I have to invest it. And it's going to take a few years for all of this to work itself out. So I can't just take a loan that I got to pay like 10% interest on because I won't be able to pay it back, right?
Yeah.
So that's not going to work. And the moment a bank hears that you want growth capital to take a risk to grow your business, that's a big that's a red flag, right? And on the other side, you're kind of squeezed in by the other side in that, if you want to try and go out there and raise equity capital, your established channels are to go to venture capitalists and angel investors. But for the most part, they're not interested in you. And the reason why they're not interested in you is that you don't have a business that they think will turn into $1 billion market.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And the reality is that 99.99% of all freelancer businesses are not businesses that are ever going to earn $1 billion in revenues, like ever.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be hugely successful and earn six figures or high six figures or even low seven figures. I mean, that very well is within the realm of possibility, and that would be huge success. But from a VC's point of view, investing in you for that type of return doesn't make any sense for them at all, right? They only have a small staff. They can only afford to do a certain number of deals. And the amount of time it takes to get to know you and configure a deal and negotiate. I mean, there's just the payback for them isn't there. So they're not going to do it. So for a lot of freelancers who need growth capital in amounts of anywhere from 10,000 to a few 100,000, there really is no place in the marketplace to turn. There's a huge gap, right? So that's one area that we've been doing a lot of work on in essentially devising new solutions that can get them that capital, at the same time are constructed in a way that we can bring in traditional capital providers who look at that risk and sort of say, yeah, I'll buy that. I want some of that, please. Right?
Yeah.
I'll put 20 million against that. I'll put 50 million against that. And now you have this capacity to scale it and grow it. But we're in very early stages of that. But that's a huge need. The second area that we see a huge need is, you mentioned this at the very beginning of our talk, which is you were talking about how you had to provide all these 1099 documents for a mortgage and your husband just had to do a W-2. Yeah, we see that. Look, we see that happening a lot. A lot of freelancers come to us and say, I can't get a mortgage. Or, you know what? I was employed at a Fortune 500 company. I had a mortgage. I now left and I'm a successful freelancer and I actually earn more money than I earned when I was working at that big company. But I wanted to go refinance my mortgage and my banker basically said, no, I can't do that. Even though I am your mortgage banker today, come back, tell me when you have 2 or 3 years of audited financials. And, they place a burden of proof that, a professional organization with a full-time finance department and a professional CFO would understand how to keep the records of and process and do all those things. But for most normal freelancers, even if they were sophisticated enough to understand how to keep those records and anticipate, they don't even have the time to do it. Right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
So again, they're busy doing their business. They're on that hamster wheel. They don't have the time to even gather and organize their documents and then be able to sort of present themselves as a picture that is a good risk to take to their banker. They can't, that connecting those simple dots is extraordinarily hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key takeaways from our conversation here for freelancers is it's really on you to connect with the companies, with the thought leaders, with the legislators, with the people who are actively doing work, trying to make things easier for freelancers, because the progress is slow, but things are happening out there. And the more that you can voice what you need and some of the challenges that you have, and also just keep yourself informed about who out there is trying to come up with solutions. For years, I really struggled with the issue of taking out a business loan. I just needed $5,000 or $10,000 to make an investment in something to expand my operations. The only place that I could get that was from a PayPal working capital loan, simply because of the volume that I did through PayPal. And it was just sort of happenstance that I stumbled across that. So freelancers really need to educate yourself about new companies, new organizations, new options, apps that are out there. Put yourself in the position to be connected to these thought leaders and companies that are pushing the envelope and trying to come up with these solutions. Because even though progress has been slow, it is getting better, but it is still on you to be able to say, I need to keep my finger on the pulse of what is happening. So I know Numina is doing a lot of great work in that area. And there's other places that freelancers should be connected to as well, just kind of see what is happening. People definitely hear our plight of how difficult it is to get a mortgage, get health insurance, buy a vehicle without a W-2, and all of these other things that really come up in our businesses. So continue to stay informed and to voice your opinions as well. So Andre, where can listeners go to learn a little bit more about you and the work you're doing?
So we'd love to have conversations with freelancers who are looking for capital to grow their business and just aren't quite sure how to do it. You can come and visit us at numina.pro, Noumena.pro. And, we have an app that is a platform where you can download it and then come on board and meet other freelancers like yourself, network. And it's only for freelancers. We don't allow any sort of other third parties to come in. And on that platform, we supply you with services and tools that you can start to use to actually improve your business financially and get access to capital. And we basically facilitate all of that and provide capital to people who are looking for it. So it's a new type of notion, which, for lack of a better word, I would call it, sort of sociable finance, right?
Yeah.
You have a community of people, and just by interacting with that community, you begin to tell your story, and you can then get access to capital to team up with other members of the community to create new things and do new projects. And we supply you with all of those tools and services to make it easy for you to do that. So yeah, we'd love to, if you're listening to this and you're looking for capital to grow your business, we'd love to talk to you and figure out how to make capital work for you and not have it be something that becomes a depressing negative thought for you just to think about trying to figure out how to do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today and chatting with me about these important topics.
Thank you very much for having me.